So what we're going to be looking at in this session is how we can use OAuth2 to do authentication with the SMTP client. So first we have a legal disclaimer, and let's look at the agenda. First I want to do is talk a little bit about authentication versus authorization. Then I'm going to talk about why we would want to use OAuth2 for our SMTP authentication. I'm going to talk about the various flows that can be used with OAuth2, and I'm going to look specifically at two flows, what's called the authorization flow and then the device authorization flow. We're going to look at how we can configure Azure to allow us to do the SMTP authentication using OAuth2, and also how to configure Gmail to allow us to use OAuth2 for SMTP authentication. We're going to look at some sample code, and then finally we're going to look at the demo. And then after that, we'll have questions and answers. So first, a little bit about me. I've been using PowerBuilder since about 1.0b. I'm also rather fluent in Oracle PL SQL, Java, and C#, and as well as C++. Also, recent open source project I've been involved in is the open source PFC libraries. This is a little bit about the company I work for. Okay, let's talk about authentication versus authorization. So the thing that always comes up as a question when we talk about using OAuth2 for authentication is it's actually an authorization protocol or an authorization framework. It's not specifically meant to be used for authentication, but it does rely on the identity server to provide authentication before it issues an OAuth token, which is how we're able to go ahead and use OAuth2 to do authentication, even though it's not specifically in an authentication framework. If you're interested in more about this, there is something called OpenID Connect, and what that is that's a protocol that's built on top of OAuth2 that actually provides for both authentication and authorization. So now that we've covered that, why would we want to use OAuth2 for SMTP authentication? Well, one of the big factors is that it secures your credentials. You don't have to provide the client application with the username and password for the Gmail or Azure account. What the application does is it basically delegates the authentication off to OAuth2 and allows the identity provider and the authorization server to verify the client, and that preserves the security of the credentials. It also allows you to limit the privileges granted to the application. If the application had the user's username and password, they could log in. Somebody has nefarious intentions could take that and log into the user's account and do a lot more than just send email. This was actually an issue with when I did the original SMTP demo app. I actually embedded my Gmail username and password in it in one of the versions that I made available. And somebody got into my Gmail account and put up $500 worth of Google Ads. Fortunately, I was able to get that reversed, but that's really an example of why you want to secure those credentials and limit the rights that the user has. And then finally, when you are using OAuth2, usually providers such as Google and Azure already have multi-factor authentication built in. So when your application redirects to OAuth2 in order to get the user to authenticate, when the user authenticates, Google or Azure will then do something like require them to access their authenticator app on their phone or respond to an SMS message. There'll be some other way that they're using other than just a username password to validate the user is actually the user. So it's a much more secure authentication protocol. So there's a number of OAuth flows. First of all, and this is the primary flow used, is the authorization flow. So in the authorization flow, the client acts directly with the authentication server and receives the auth token directly back. And then there's an option for using proof key for client exchange to increase the security of that token. There's an auth flow called implicit grant. There is an auth flow called resource owner credential grant type. There is a flow called client credentials. This is used primarily for machine-to-machine communications. There's the device authorization flow. And that's usually meant for devices such as smart TVs that have limited input options. So the idea is that the client provides a QR code and a device code that is shown to the user. They take their phone or whatever, they scan the QR code that launches the browser on their local device. They enter the device code, and that triggers the generation of the auth code, which the client can then go get. And that way the user's not trying to log in on their smart TV. They can do it through their personal device. And I'll talk a little bit about why I want to feature that particular flow. And lastly, there's the refresh token grant. Now, this isn't this isn't a flow that's used to get the original auth token. It's a flow that's used to refresh an access token that you already have. So like I said, we're going to talk about the authorization flow, and we're going to talk about the device authorization flow. And the third one down there is also important, the refresh token grant. That can be used by your application, like I mentioned, to refresh a token you already have, so you don't have to require the user to re-grant access. We're not going to cover that in this session, but that is important. So once again, the authorization flow, it's used primarily by web applications, and it's the normal means of which OAuth tokens are obtained. And it's easier for web applications to do it because they're already responding to URL requests or URI requests. So with the auth flow, authorization flow, you define a redirect URI for your client. And so what happens is when they log in using the browser, the user authenticates and authorizes the app, and then the authorization server sends back a redirect URI, which basically would just go back to the application. The browser would, take that and use that to send the token back to the application. So that works great with an web application that's already, responding to URI requests. PowerBuilder app isn't doing that. So it's a little bit more difficult for a PowerBuilder app to handle a redirect URI. And that's the reason I wanted to show the option of the device authorization flow. Because not only does it work for limited input devices like smart TVs, but it could also be useful for us as PowerBuilder developers, because it means we don't have to deal with a redirect URI. It's a much more direct means of us to get the token. And then, as I mentioned, the refresh token flow is actually important, not for the original authorization, but for refreshing the token so the user doesn't have to constantly re-grant access to the client. So let's talk about authorization flow. So this is how it works. So we have our PowerBuilder client, and what we're going to do is we're going to generate a URL that includes that points to the authorization server, and also includes in the URL the client ID, and in the case of Azure, it also has the tenant ID. The scopes that we want to be able to use, what permissions we want to have, and that redirect URI. This is how we get the token back to us. We send that off to a browser. Normally we would want to invoke the system browser rather than a browser within a window of the app itself. It's a little more secure that way. If it's a system browser, we know that the client has less opportunity to try to capture the information that's entered into the browser there. If you launch into a browser in a window that could open up the opportunity for you to try to capture the information that the user enters into the screen as they're trying to log in. However, what we're going to do for the demo is we're actually going to do the less secure approach. We are going to open a window that has a browser in it and then launch the URL from there. To just point out, we're just doing this for this demo. That's not the way you'd want to actually do it with your application. Next, so we've opened up that URL. What that does is it takes that request for the auth token, and well, first what it does is it prompts the user to log in. And once they've logged in, and it will prompt the user whether or not they want to actually grant the requested scope, the requested privs to that application. If they say yes, then that sends the request up to the authentication server. The authentication server then sends back the auth token as part of the redirect URL, and that's sent back to the browser. And so when the browser receives that, and it's usually localhost something, that will trigger, well, for a client application like PowerBuilder, it would be a localhost. But it calls that redirect URL to return the auth token back to the client. Now, like I said, we're not a server-based application. We're running on the desktop. We're going to use localhost as part of our redirect URL if we do this approach. Now, what we would normally do if we're going to do this is we'd use something like WinSock PBNI or WinSock from the TopWiz programming site in order to monitor a port. But for the demo, what we're going to do, as I mentioned before, is we're going to open up the browser in a window. And by doing that, that allows us to capture the redirect event and capture the auth token that way. Once again, I'm doing this for the demo. This is not how you would do it in a production application. You would use something like WinSock or WinSock PBNI to listen on a port instead. And a couple of years ago, I did a demonstration of doing SSO, and I have in that sample code for that session, I did use the WinSock libraries from TopWiz to capture an OAuth token being returned through a redirect URL. So this is PowerBuilder now extracting the auth token from the redirect URL. It then attaches that auth token to the SMT message and sends it off to the SMTP server. At that point, the SMTP server validates the auth token against the authentication server, the authorization server. And if the token is valid, it sends off the email. So that's the authorization flow. Let's look at the device authorization flow. This is the limited input device flow. So in this one, the PowerBuilder client is going to do a REST call directly to the authorization server. I keep confusing those two terms. And we send in that the client ID, and for Azure, we send the tenant ID as well, and the requested scopes. But we're not doing it through the browser. We're doing a direct REST API call. So we have the REST client object or the HTTP client object that's native to PowerBuilder, so that's easy for us to do. That's going to send back a REST response, and that's going to include a device code. Now, this isn't the auth token. This is device code. It's something we can exchange for an auth token. And the second thing it's going to send back is a URL that we can call to take that device code and send it to the authorization server, and it will send us back the auth token. So typically what you would do at this point is you would generate a QR code for the URL, display that to the user. They would get out their device. They would scan that. It would open up the browser. That's going to call the authorization server, which is going to prompt them to enter the device code. And the user would enter the device code. Once again, at that point, then they would log in and decide whether or not they're going to grant the application access to the resources that are being requested. What we're going to do instead is we're going to open up the browser on the local device. And we're going to copy the device code into the clipboard. And that way, during our demo, when that page displays, we can just paste the device code directly into the browser. Once again, I'm doing this for the demo. It's not necessarily the way you want to do it in a production application. So the users entered the device code into the page. They get prompted to log in. They authorize the application. At that point, that sends a message to the authentication server, which then generates the auth token and makes it available on a known URL. Well, since that's on a known URL, we can do another REST call. And we do that to retrieve the token. So you see how rather than having to use a WinSock library to monitor a port, how this is a lot more natural for a Power Builder application to use this flow. One difference here with Google, not only will we send the client ID and the device code in our REST call to the authorization server, we'll send the client secret as well. And we'll get into the client ID, client secret when we get more into the slides here. So at that point, we've made our REST API call, and the response from the REST API call is our auth token. And then it looks just like the authorization flow from that point on. We attach the auth token to the SMTP message, send it off to the SMTP server. SMTP server validates it, and if it is valid, it goes ahead and sends the email. Okay, now that we understand how the flows work, let's go and see how we create the client in Azure and Google to allow the apps to do this. We start with Azure. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Microsoft, the Azure portal, and we'll click on Microsoft Entra ID. And then we'll do a new app registration. In the new app registration, what we're going to do is we're going to define what kind of accounts can use the app. And then we can provide a redirect URL. Now, we can do this regardless of whether we're doing the authentication flow or the device authorization flow. If we use the device authorization flow, it will just ignore the redirect URI. If we use the authorization flow, then it will use it. So we don't have to create two different clients for the two different flows. When we get to Google, we will have to do that. So I just want to point out that difference. So at this point, we want to copy off the tenant ID and the client ID for the application, because we will use those in the OAuth requests to identify the client. So then we go into Manage and select API Permissions. And under there, we'll select Microsoft.Graph. We'll select Delegated Permissions. And then if you type in SMTP, you'll see SMTP Send as a scope. And we'll go ahead and select that, indicating when this client is authorized, it can send email. Then we use the grant admin consent for default directory option here to take and apply that to the privileges, the scopes that are for this application. The user read that's mentioned there, that's automatically assigned when we created the app, but we've added the SMTP send. So let's look at, and then we're done. We've configured Azure. Let's look at Gmail. So in Gmail, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Google Cloud, and we're going to create a project there, similar to what we did in Azure. Then we'll say we want to explore and enable APIs. Then we want to configure the OAuth consent screen. So we'll click on Get Started. We'll provide information about our application. Define the audience. Provide contact information. Agree to the terms, and then hit Finish. So now under Data Access, we're going to click Add or Remove Scopes. And you can select the first three that appear there. That's the user info, email, profile, and OpenID scopes. And then you want to manually add the https://mail.google.com/scope. That's the scope that allows this application to send email. So it should look like this when you're done. And so the one we added manually is down here under the restricted scopes. Now we'll go in and click Clients, and this is where everything we've done so far applies regardless of which flow we want to use. But at this point, this is where we start getting into the flow-specific process where we have to create a different client for each of the different flows. So let's say we want to do the Auth flow first. So we'll say Create Client. And it will list actually a number of different client types. And each of the different client types uses a different auth flow. The web application, that uses the authorization flow. The TV and limited input devices uses the device authorization flow. And there's also one there that says desktop app. And that we can't use. There's a problem with, at least at this point, with the Gmail configuration admin screens here that render that one pretty much useless. And we'll get into that actually. So right now we're going to use the authorization flow. So we'll create a web application, even though this isn't a web application. That's the client type we'll use. We'll give it a name, and then we'll give it a redirect URI. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that will be localhost something, because we want the browser to redirect to the local machine. So in fact, there it is right there, localhost and a port name is all I've got. So click Create. Once again, capture the client ID and the client secret, because this is how we're going to tell the Gmail authorization server which application this is that is requesting access. And at that point, we're set for authorization flow. Let's briefly look at the desktop client and see why that, that would be, when I first went in and set this up, I thought that was going to be the client I was going to use. It uses the authentication flow, and it uses a redirect URI, but it's meant for desktop apps. PowerBuilder is a desktop app. Why wouldn't we want to use this? Well, the problem is when you go to create your desktop app, there's no option down here to create the redirect URI. Well, that's required. When you do your authentication call, you have to pass the redirect URI. And what the authorization service, I've got it right. So what the authorization server is supposed to do is it's supposed to only allow you to specify your redirect URI in your request that matches the ones that are defined for the application. Well, we can't define one for the application. And so the calls will always fail. And I don't know why this is still broken. So anyway, that's why we don't use the desktop flow. So we're going to use the TV and limited input device flow in order to try to do a device authorization flow. Well, unfortunately, Google once again shot themselves or shot us in the foot because they only support a limited number of scopes for this particular client. And sending emails is not one of the supported scopes. So we're not going to be able to send email using device authorization flow for Gmail. It works with Azure, not with Gmail. I'm going to go ahead and show you how you would set this up in case you wanted to use this OAuth token for something else, let's say SSO. So you would go ahead and create the client and capture the ID and the secret. And at that point, we're set to go using Gmail for the device authentication flow. So I'm not going to show all of the sample code. What the sample code has, it has 4 different functions. One to do Azure authentication flow, one to do Azure device authentication flow, one to do Gmail authentication flow, authorization flow, and one to do Gmail device authorization flow, even though the token we get back from that can't be used for email. But it shows all 4 of those options. And that's a lot of code to go through. You can download the sample code and go through it on your own. The important point I wanted to show here is how we set up the SMTP client message differently when we're doing OAuth versus username password. So in the sample code, I will look to see whether or not you're trying to do username password or OAuth. And so if you do username password, what we're going to put on the client is an auth type of 2, which means username password. We'll set the username as the email address that we're sending the email from, and then you go ahead and use the password. However, if we're doing OAuth, we're going to set the auth type to 5. That means we're doing OAuth. We're still going to set the username to the email address of the person that's sending the email. But now we're not going to provide a password. Instead, we will set the OAuth2 access token to the token that we got back from one of those 4 function calls. So let's go ahead and take a look at a demo. So this is the sample application. And I know I said I wasn't going to show a whole lot of sample code, but I just wanted to show that there are, here's the 2 Azure methods, one for the authentication flow and one for the device authentication flow, and the 2 Gmail methods, one for authentication, one for device authentication. And because the device paths require 2 REST API calls, there's also these 2 functions that handle the device code to auth token conversion. Okay, so that's all there for you to download and take a look at your leisure. Let's go ahead and see how this works. So I'm going to go to authentication and say OAuth, and we're going to use the authentication flow with Gmail. This is the one that does use the redirect URI. So it's going to come up and ask us to log in. And I need to grab my password for Gmail here. So we are logged in. And this is the MFA in operation. It's requiring me to acknowledge on my device that I am logging in. And I've done that. Now it's asking me, do I really want to, do I really trust this app to send email on my behalf? And I say, okay. And the email got sent. And if I go over here and look, it just came in. So there's the email. It just came in through Gmail, through the authorization flow. Now I want to look at using device authorization flow. And as I mentioned as we're doing the presentation, that doesn't work with Gmail because Google doesn't allow you to send email with that authorization flow. And so we're going to use Azure instead. So I'm going to, now what it's done there is it's launched the system browser and it's pasted the code into the clipboard. And I'm going to paste that in. And it's asking me to log in. Now I'm going to use a different account for this. And the password for that. So I'm logging in once again to Azure this time. And once again, I'm being prompted, do you really trust this application? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to close that window, close this. Email got sent. Check my local email client again. Give it a second or two. And there it is. So there's the email that just got sent via Azure using the device authorization flow. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, so that was it for the demo. And that's about it for the presentation. I did want to point out that if you want to connect with Appian or other Power Builder developers, there's a lot of ways to do it. The one I most highly recommend is community.appian.com because there's a question and answer area in there. There's code exchange where we can share sample code with one another, and blogs, all that kind of stuff. So really would recommend that. And then with that, let's do our question and answers.
Now is Q&A time. Welcome to join our live Q&A Zoom meeting with the presenter. You'll find the Zoom meeting link at the top of the chat panel and also in the resources area below. Just click and join us live. You can enter the meeting from the Zoom app or your browser. Just type your name and click Join. You'll be in a waiting room until the meeting starts, and you'll join automatically once it begins. Now that you're in, you have 10 minutes to ask the presenter any questions about this session. Don't miss the chance.